Hello everyone, and welcome back to another whiteboard video. Today we're going to talk about 5 things that I have learned over about a decade or so of lifting. These are things that I wish that I knew when I started, and that I hope that can help many of you in avoiding common mistakes, common misconceptions, and just avoiding assumptions that can really hurt you, not necessarily physically, but in terms of progress, in terms of, injury risk, those kinds of things, and more. So the first and what I think is probably one of the most important things to recognize is if you're the average person lifting weights, there are no must-do exercises. So what does that mean? Well, a lot of people come into lifting or are introduced to lifting because maybe they have a strong friend, or maybe they're related to someone who's super into lifting, and oftentimes these people have an obsession with particular movements, right? Kind of in the same way that if you're really into movies, you probably have like a top 3 on your movie chart, and so you might highly recommend those movies to your friends and your family. And the same thing works with exercise, and oftentimes people become obsessed with exercise specifically because of the fact that they're obsessed with specific exercises. And so when people are getting introduced to lifting weights, they're often introduced via this pattern of someone teaching them a movement or telling them about the results they've got from a particular movement. And oftentimes, what's most commonly associated with this are the barbell squat, the barbell bench, and the barbell deadlift. Now, these are by no means movements that are good or bad in absolute, right? Context makes them so. But just recognize that you don't have to perform squats. You don't have to perform bench presses. You don't have to perform deadlifts. You don't have to do any single exercise. And while there may be tons of benefits to squats, tons of benefits to deadlifts and bench press, you can achieve those benefits in so many different kinds of ways that you should not arbitrarily constrain yourself to one option. Imagine if, someone said, hey, you're only allowed to watch these 3 movies on repeat. You'd be like, what are you talking about? That's crazy. There are tens of thousands, if not more, movie options for you to view. And the same applies to exercise. Maybe not tens of thousands of exercises, but some kind of variation to, a lot of them that can effectively make an exercise list infinite from a practical perspective. So that's number 1. Number 2 is rep ranges, and really the conversation around the idea that certain rep ranges, I'm trying to talk as I write here, that certain rep ranges are superior without any context to others. And so much in the same way that you have sort of zealots of particular exercises, just like you must do these exercises, there are certain people that say you must train in these rep ranges for XYZ outcome. You must train in the 1 to 5 rep range for strength. You must train in the 10 to 15 range for hypertrophy. And the reality is that depending on the goal, of course, certain rep ranges in certain contexts can be more beneficial, but on average, I think that people stress out way too much about what specific rep range they're using and how consistent that is over, long term for their training and then also within each exercise. So a lot of people think that they need to do certain reps for certain exercises and certain reps for other exercises. So just to draw a sort of parallel to the first example, if you're doing squats or benches or deadlifts, people often think that those are constrained to lower rep ranges. And if you're doing quote unquote accessory movements, which is a term that powerlifters have sort of poisoned the overall industry with, like a lateral raise, let's say, lateral raises are supposedly an exercise where you can only do higher reps. And I think it's important to recognize that the rep range that you use is simply just a tool, a means to an end. So if the rep range is appropriate for the goal, then use whatever rep range that you want to. If you want to get stronger in the 3 to 5 rep range, do 3 to 5 reps. If you want to get stronger in the 10 to 15 rep range, do 10 to 15 reps. If you want to get bigger, well, getting bigger is really just about doing enough volume and enough hard sets within whatever rep range that you want and making sure that you're eating enough food over time. Now, in addition, and the sort of last thing I'll say on rep ranges is just that certain movements will, I think, lend a little bit better just based on the context of the movements, how you're doing them to certain rep ranges over others. Okay, so address this on an exercise basis. You don't have to pick you don't have to pick an arbitrary constraint of 10 to 15 or 10 to 20, right? You can pick anything in the 1 to 30 rep range, and as long as it fits the particular context in the application that you're trying to use it for, thumbs up. And guess what? That can change over time, and in all likelihood, it probably should change over time. Now, number 3, what is number 3? Well, a lot of people think about exercise as motion. And motion is important. What is motion? Well, we can think about motion in terms of the human body as change in position of the different axes and the pivot points in our body, which results in displacement of bone, right? And in simpler terms, motion is basically a net imbalance of force, which causes something to move through space, right? And it's sensible to associate motion with exercise. But when I talk about no motion, or really more specifically, focus on no motion, what I mean is that a lot of people, when they get introduced to a movement, right, it's even in the language that we use, a movement, a motion, they concentrate on what is moving, right, which is sensible, I think, in large part. But what we have to keep in mind is, in any system that is moving, there must be components of that system that are not moving, right? By definition, motion is a relative thing. So if I'm moving my arms like this all over the place, there has to be some sort of relative part of me that is fixed, right? Because otherwise I'm just floating in space. So when we're talking about exercise, I used to really concentrate a lot on what was moving and how I was moving it. And there's no doubt that at some point that's going to be really, really important, at least in many cases. But in many more cases, what I find is that what people have trouble doing is not really the moving, it's more like the not moving. So what's a good example? Well, if you're doing a squat or if you're doing a deadlift, it might benefit you if you're trying to really predominantly train your legs, let's say, to not move your spine. A lot of people have trouble not moving their spine in a deadlift or a squat. And conversely, let's say if you were trying to do a motion for your erectors, it would behoove you to move your spine and not move your hips. Now, there are many different ways in which we can go about focusing on this no motion concept, but another example, let's say, is in a curl. Instead of thinking about moving the weight upward, really just try to think about not moving the upper arm, because that's what's appropriate for the goal. So in any exercise, in my estimation, a really great framing to take is what is supposed to not be moving in this motion, and what kinds of internal cues can I use, what kinds of external stability can I use to make sure that those things don't move so that I can more precisely accomplish the goal. So if any of you are struggling with an exercise, try to prioritize and think about what is not moving as opposed to what is. And like I said, there are many instances where focusing on what is moving is equally, if not more, beneficial. But by and large, I think that most people focus on motion rather than lack thereof. And I think that if that's you, and if you are struggling in your exercise, try to focus on this no motion thing. All right, number 4, skills over load. So this one is, I think, fairly straightforward in terms of what you might imagine that this means. But much like the motion, no motion thing, I think a lot of people have a fascination with load, right? Load is always front of mind for people. If I'm using more load, that's better. If I'm using less load, that's worse. That's just sort of the mindset that I think a lot of people, much like these other ones, are introduced to lifting with. And a lot of times what you'll notice is that the biggest guys, and oftentimes the strongest guys, are not particularly concerned about how much they're lifting. And so what you see over time is, as people get bigger and stronger, you see a relative amount of decrease in focus on load as opposed to a relative amount of increase. Now, obviously there are exceptions to this rule, like if you're a power lifter, you kind of have to, by definition, be focused on load, right? But overall, even power lifters who are the most concerned with load, that's the primary goal, is the highest level guys, they're focused on practicing the skills, right? Because what does practicing the skill do? Practicing the skill, in essence, necessitates that more load needs to be added over time. Think about any skill you've ever improved in your life. could be a musical instrument, could be an athletic capability. It could simply be learning about a subject, like learning is a skill. And when skills are the primary focus and skill development is the primary focus, and you are constantly getting better at that skill, what needs to happen is more load, more stress needs to be imparted on you to continue to improve the skill. But the load is not necessarily what should be the primary focus. The primary focus should be this development and improvement of the skill and troubleshooting of the skill, so that the load as an emergent property of that improvement will increase. Right? So obviously, you're probably not doing something right if after a year of training you've not gotten any stronger on any of your movements, but I've never seen that been the case when someone really just puts a hyper focus on the skill. Great example of this, if any of you know him, Hafthor Bjornsson, who was at one point the world's strongest man for several years. I think he's probably pulled, 1,000 pounds or something like that, 6'8", humongous guy. If you watch the way that he trains, of course, not everyone should train like this necessarily, but he really has such a hyper focus on skill, and he's one of the strongest people in the world. And by definition, he's needed to add more load over time only when it's really been appropriate relative to his current skill set. Right? So if you're experiencing breakdowns in form because you're using too much load, you are not prioritizing the skill. So again, not me saying load isn't important, but rather that skill is sort of the avenue through which we should be focused and the avenue through which we could be able to sort of add more load over time. Again, all with just this focus on technique relative to the specific context. All right, and then the last one, and this is going to relate closely to number one. Force is equal to force. What does that mean? Well, a lot of people, as I've said with all of these, which is why these are the 5 that really prominently came to mind, assume that different kinds of implements, different kinds of exercises are superior on account of their emotional attachment to them. And what this often leads to is this assumption that certain exercises have mystical, magical properties that others don't possess. And I want to just make it super clear to all of you that although you have very specific images, pictures painted of specific exercise in your head, and specifically what those exercises feel like, regardless of what it is, it's always going to be a consequence of this. So whether you're looking at a barbell squat or a leg press or a cable curl versus a barbell curl versus a curl with resistance bands versus kettlebells, right? All of this is just application of force to our bodies. And so if you can kind of try to, and again, this is very closely associated with number one, right? Because why do people become attached to certain exercises and assume that certain exercises are must do? It's because people have good experiences with those exercises and they assume that they're going to be best for everyone all the time and that they're going to feel the same, right? But as many of you may or may not know, if you told 10 people to do a squat who are standing in a room, all of whom have different structures, you're going to see probably close to 10 different outcomes, right? So a squat is not a squat, and the way that we can analyze each squat and determine what it actually is doing to an individual and why potentially it feels the way that it does, good or bad relative to the person, it can all just come back to this. You ask yourself, what are the forces in this scenario and how do I have to respond to it? You don't have to make all of these claims that are based purely on your subjective emotional experience of an exercise, although of course that's perfectly fine, right? As long as you're speculating as such and not as fact. Ultimately, this framework is probably the thing that sort of is the bedrock of all of these others, which is ultimately that, again, there are not these sort of unique categories of exercise that subjectively will just be best for everyone, but rather what we can maybe glean from those exercises is, okay, what are the forces that are associated with these exercises? And as a sort of consequence of understanding all of that and understanding that every exercise is merely just an equation of force and how it interacts with your anatomy, you can start to get a better sense of like just less overall attachment to certain exercises. And that, in my opinion, can allow you to make much better decisions for yourself and for your client. Are you someone that wants to be able to target any muscle in your body when you're lifting, but you also don't give a shit about complicated anatomy and biomechanics? If you are, then this is a perfect ebook for you. The Target Any Muscle ebook is not really an ebook. It's more like a lifetime cheat sheet guide to lifting. You need a total of 0 understanding of anatomy and biomechanics to understand this material. And that's because every chapter chapter is full of tons of different diagrams and very visual, simple explanations about how to set up an exercise for any muscle. In addition, every chapter functions as a standalone guide, so you can simply click on the table of contents and navigate to any muscle group that you're training on any given day. Every single chapter includes visuals of how to stretch any muscle, how to shorten any muscle, how to load any muscle, and then how to stabilize your body so that you can train that muscle appropriately. And in addition, at the end of every chapter, there's a training FAQ to address commonly asked questions and a full video lecture summarizing each chapter with me and my skeleton model to demonstrate. This is meant to function as a cheat sheet for life. This should be the last product that you ever purchase about how to lift. I hope you all enjoy the guide. Happy gains.